All right, let's get back to reading someone else's mail. If the thought of that makes you feel the least bit guilty, put yourself at ease. Although it is a letter Paul the Apostle wrote to followers of Jesus in Philippi 2,000 years ago, it was ultimately written to be read by anyone and everyone. I appreciate the way this version of the Bible has the portion we're in this week, beginning with Paul writing, "I'm not saying I have this all together, but I have it made." I don't know about you, but I find that encouraging. Most scholars believe Paul was at least in his 60s. He knew more about the Jewish scriptures than anyone at that time, and as much as anyone in history. He had been in ministry for 3 decades and had planted churches across much of the Roman Empire. So if Paul didn't have it all together, the rest of us should be able to breathe a big sigh of relief. Paul continued, "I'm well on my way, reaching out for Christ, who has so wondrously reached out for me. Friends, don't get me wrong. By no means do I count myself an expert in all of this, but I've got my eye on the goal where God is beckoning us onward to Jesus. I'm off and running, and I'm not turning back." Pay special attention to the phrase, "I'm off and running." Well-known Bible historian William Barclay wrote, "As Paul saw it, the Christian is the athlete of Christ." An athlete of Christ. And that definition gives me an excuse to talk about one of my favorite things. Very little brings me more pleasure than running. I'm not great at it, and I'm slower than ever, but there isn't much that keeps me from lacing up my shoes, and not much stops me once I get going. I remember my first so-called long-distance runs way back when I was 13. 2 laps around a block where Billy Salt lived. In total, might have been half a mile. It wasted us, but we did it again the next day, and the next, and the next. And then we would lay on our backs in the grass afterwards and talk about the marathons we were going to run one day. That was 45 years ago. I've had the opportunity to run 6 marathons, a 33-mile race up in Big Bear, a 55-mile run, thousands of miles of plain old jogging, and one morning back in Canada when I headed out with my old running buddy on a morning when it was minus 70 degrees with the wind chill, just so we could say we did it. The bottom line is I can relate to this portion from Philippians as well as anything Paul wrote. "I've got my eye on the goal," he said, "where God is beckoning us onward to Jesus. I'm off and running, and I'm not turning back." Let's keep focused on that goal. Those of us who want everything God has for us. If any of you have something else in mind, something less than total commitment, God will clear your blurred vision. You'll see it yet. Now that we're on the right track, let's stay on it. Keep track of those you see running this same course, headed for this same goal. I see parallels to Paul's approach to life in the sanitized, televised version of the movie Forrest Gump. And please don't take this as a recommendation of the movie, especially not the non-sanitized version. But as Forrest Gump, Tom Hanks, said, "One day, for no particular reason, I decided to go for a little run. So I ran to the end of the road. And when I got there, I thought maybe I'd run to the end of town. And when I got there, I thought maybe I'd just run across Greenbow County. And I figured, since I'd run this far, maybe I'd run across the great state of Alabama. And that's what I did." He said, "I ran clear across Alabama. For no particular reason, I just kept on going. I ran clear to the ocean. And when I got there, I figured since I'd gone this far, I might as well turn around and just keep on going. When I got to another ocean, I figured since I'd gone this far, I might as well just turn back and keep right on going. Now, with the parallels between Forrest Gump and Paul, there are also some big differences. I like the way a bunch of people made Forrest kind of like their cult leader. Paul would have hated that, but Forrest didn't seem to mind. He just kept running without saying a word, and people just kept following. Then one day, as he put it, after 3 years, 2 months, 14 days, and 16 hours, he stopped. And he turned to face his followers, and everyone got quiet because their leader was going to speak. And Forrest Gump said, "I'm pretty tired. I think I'll just go home now." Well, Paul never hit that point. The closer he got to the end of his journey, the harder he pressed. And he kept challenging others to do the same. And that's the portion we're in today. Paul challenging others to keep on keeping on. My first cross-country coach drummed it into us that whether we were racing or training, we should always reach down deep and press harder over the last part than any other point in the run. And that's what Paul was saying. He wrote, "I press on to take hold of that for which Christ Jesus took hold of me. I do not consider myself yet to have taken hold of it. But one thing I do, forgetting what is behind and straining toward what is ahead, I press on." You can't notice it in English, but Paul was using a picture of a runner in a race and someone in the military. He was using military and athletic terms in there. They were words for a military unit together in coordinated, all-out pursuit of something or someone. And he was using a picture of a runner in a race, focusing on the finish line, drawing every ounce of energy and straining and leaning toward the finish line. That image resonates in what he wrote. I have not yet reached my goal, and I am not perfect, but Christ has taken hold of me. So I keep on running and struggling to take hold of the prize. My friends, I don't feel that I have already arrived, but I forget what is behind, and I struggle for what is ahead. Forget what is behind. That is a valuable piece of advice for any race. The 100 yards you just ran do not matter as much as the 100 yards ahead of you. Oh, there is benefit in learning from past races and training runs, but to a large degree, one of the best things you can do is put what is behind you behind you. One of the first things I was taught when I started running races was to resist the urge to look back over your shoulder. That's especially true in trail races because the smallest miscue can crash you like into a tree or send you falling off a trail. Backward glances can throw your stride off and it can slow you down. Not to mention it can mess with your mind, depending on where the people behind you are. See, if you've been struggling up to that point, thinking too much about how poorly you've done can discourage you and get you wondering why you should even bother finishing. Now, if you've been flying along, or if you glance over your shoulder and see people way behind you, you can tend to ease up or get kind of cocky. Paul said he was forgetting what is behind. That meant choosing not to think too much about the past or to be controlled by the past. It's kind of like driving. You need to keep glancing at your rearview mirrors, but you're in a lot of trouble if you fixate on them. Most driving is about looking forward through the windshield. Oh, Paul kept telling people to live gratefully, so I don't believe he wanted anyone to wipe their memory banks clean. I mean, harmful or ugly things he was rescued from, and memories of breakthroughs in ministry fed his gratitude. And he wanted to hold on to those in order to continue to be grateful. But Paul was saying yesterday's achievements or memories of how things used to be should not get in the way of what remains to be done. The phrase resting on your laurels comes to mind. The Greeks awarded wreaths of laurel leaves to the winners of the ancient Pythian games, and someone who rests on his laurels is someone who is content with or stuck in the past and past achievements. I mean, having good old days is wonderful, but living there is another thing entirely. Bible teacher Warren Wiersbe wrote, "Do not say, 'Why were the former days better than these?' You do not move ahead," he said, "by constantly looking in a rearview mirror." He said the past is a rudder to guide you, not an anchor to drag you. We must learn from the past, but not live in the past. And that was Paul's point. He said, I've got my eye on the goal, where God is beckoning us onward to Jesus. And I'm off and running, and I'm not turning back. So let's keep focused on that goal. Those of us who want everything God has for us. One road race illustrates the Christian life for me. It kept coming to mind as I studied today's portion from Philippians. The race is 20 kilometers, 13 miles, around one of the larger lakes in Saskatchewan. It passes through a First Nations reservation. That's what Canadian natives are called. Many First Nations people run the race. For some, it's a test of their manhood, and for others, it's a way to pay respect to the way their ancestors used to get around. I'll never forget the first time I ran it. I had trained hard, and I felt more ready for a race than ever. I spent the night in a little hotel there. I had this massive mound of spaghetti for supper. I soaked in a tub you could have cooked lobsters in, and I got into bed just after 8 in the evening. Woke up at 5:30 feeling great. See, for me, the beauty of running is that I only compete against me. I set a goal, considering my general level of conditioning and how I've done in my training. Well, that day, the starting gun sounded, and once the initial crowd started to spread out, I was pleased with my pace, and I was feeling really good. And I passed the first of the 20 markers right where I wanted to be. Well, then, over my shoulder, I could hear footsteps and heavy breathing. And one of the First Nations runners caught up to me and passed me like I was standing still. But a quarter mile later, it happened again. I heard coming up behind me, and another guy blew right past me. And over the next couple hundred yards, a couple more whipped past. My watch said I was at the pace I had planned, but I was starting to doubt how I was really doing. Well, then, up ahead, I saw the first guy who had passed me on his back on the side of the road, like gasping for air. But 100 yards later, there was the second guy who passed me. He was bent over at the waist, and he was like, and another 100 meters down the road, another guy laying face down in the dirt, and his back was heaving as he tried to catch his breath. I passed another kilometer marker, and I was holding close to my pace, but the next thing I knew, the first guy whipped past me again, and then the second guy, and then the third. Well, it finally dawned on me that was how they ran. They would go as fast as they could, as far as they could, and then they would collapse until they got their strength back. And then they would take off again, and they would repeat that strategy all through the race. That was the way they had learned to run. And many people live their Christian lives the same way. At some point in life, Jesus becomes real to them, and they get all fired up, and they take off running. But sooner or later, they run out of steam. And then they visit church on just the right morning, or they attend a really powerful conference, or they grab a book that starts hitting them really deeply, and they decide to get back on track with God. And they vow that starting the next morning, they're going to read their Bible for half an hour, they're going to pray for half an hour, and they're going to love their neighbor, and they're going to turn the other cheek, and they're never going to lose their patience, and all these other things Jesus would do. And they do great for a couple of weeks. And then they start to run out of gas. And before long, they're pooped. Until the next powerful conference, or great church service, or latest book, and the cycle just repeats itself. See, one of the great myths of our day is that being a Christian is easy. There's a big difference between easy and simple. Becoming a Christian is simple. And many people miss God for that very reason. They expect something a lot more complicated. But becoming a Christian is simple. You hit a point where you authentically admit God is not real to you, but you want him to be. You realize Jesus is the key to knowing God, and you surrender your life to him and to following him. And that's how you become a Christian. It's simple. But being one takes work, and it takes a lifetime. But the problem is we want it all to work now. We want to step into a spiritual microwave and da-da-da-da. After 90 seconds, we pop out and we're like done. No anxiety, no drinking problems, no addictions, no eating disorders, no tears, and just this natural ability and desire to read the Bible for an hour a day and to pray for twice that long. It'd be like me getting inspired watching the Olympic marathon and deciding I want to run like that. So I lace up my shoes and I head out the door and I try to run 26 miles at 5 minutes a mile. And if you remember being forced to run even 1 mile in PE class, you know that's not the kind of thing you just decide to do. I realize all this talk about running is not for everyone. So let's turn to another Bible version for a line at the heart of the portion we're in, where Paul was referring to the ongoing, transforming work God does in his followers. And Paul wrote, "Let us hold true to what we have already attained and walk and order our lives by that." Now, the word for walk in there wasn't the one for, say, like a random leisurely walk in the park. It was more for the kind of walk that happened across the country on Thursday, on Veterans Day. That kind of walk was the coordinated, intentional, purposeful walk of a military unit. And keep that in mind and look again at the verse we just saw. Let us hold true to what we, now notice the us and the we in there. This kind of walk is not to be done alone. Let us hold true to what we have already attained and walk and order our lives by that. And the way Paul wrote this meant keep walking. The word was not intended to be literal. It was more like what's been called the Christian walk. Your Bible version may not even have the word walk. The word was more fully like keep living your life in a way that reflects your faith. In another letter, Paul referred to walking in line with the Spirit. That's what Paul was talking about in Philippians. As we saw earlier, it is to be intentional and it is to be purposeful, whether you're walking or running. And that leads me to one more running story from another year of that 13-miler around that lake in Saskatchewan. Other than Beth, there's only been one other female that I was ever serious about. And one day, I got home from work, and she had stuck a Hallmark card to my mailbox. And I was thinking, oh, what a sweetheart. I opened the card, and the word sweetheart quickly disappeared from my mind. She said she didn't have the nerve to tell me in person that she wanted to end things. And she hoped I wasn't too hurt. And then the killer of all lines, she hoped we could still be friends. Well, that happened just before the Echo Lake race. And she was a runner, and she was going to be there. My heart was not in it, but I was brought up that if you sign up for something, you do it. So I pretty much dragged myself to the start line. To try to boost my spirits, I had purchased a new pair of the latest Nikes. Big mistake. By the second mile, I had huge blisters on both feet. And before long, as I looked down, I could see blood soaking through the white nylon. And it was hot. And it was extremely humid. And I had been so down, I hadn't been eating right, and I was dehydrated. Oh, and there were fish flies. Fish flies are sticky little beasts that fly in swarms of thousands. So when you run through them, it's kind of like you hit this big old curtain of slime. And they get in your eyes and up your nose. And when you're wheezing like I was, you suck them right into your mouth. And they were all around the lake. And all those things combined to make it horrible. And I was mumbling under my breath about that girl. I was beating myself up for being an idiot. And I was whimpering about how much my feet hurt and how much I hated those bugs. But something kept my left foot slapping down in front of my right foot. And then my left foot would follow again. And somehow I crossed the finish line. Slower than previous years, but I finished. And as I drove home, I started to realize that I was actually satisfied. Maybe more satisfied than races where I'd been at my best. I had endured just about every lousy thing that could come along, and I finished. And by the time I got home, I had the radio up, and I was singing at the top of my lungs. It's like this line from the book of Hebrews. Endure, for when you have done as God requires of you, you will receive the promise. Now, the word for endure referred to a life of faith in Jesus, not to specific situations. And as for what God requires, the prophet Micah left us a simple, but not easy, checklist. He said, this is what God requires of you. To do what's right, to love mercy, and, there it is, to walk humbly with Him. Again, simple, but not always easy. But I want to continue to learn to transfer that kind of attitude into all the corners of my daily life. I want to continue to learn how to make Paul's words a reality for me. And to keep working toward that day when I will finally be all Jesus saved me for and wants me to be. And that's something you can say for yourself. Continuing with, I am still not all I should be, but I want to focus all my energies on this one thing. Forgetting the past and looking forward to what lies ahead. Straining to reach the end of the race and receive the prize for which God, through Jesus, is calling us up to heaven.